I've been to the occupied Palestinian territories and reported from there for years. I've spent a lot of time filming stories and documentaries about life under Israeli military occupation in the places that are supposed to make up a future Palestinian state. Palestinians are a people. There's a Palestinian flag. Palestine is represented at the United Nations. But for now, there's no actual Palestinian state. And I think the chance of there being one as part of a two-state solution that divides this land between Israelis and Palestinians, well, I don't think that's very likely. And I'm going to tell you why. More than 140 countries recognize Palestine as a state.
Norway recognizes the state of Palestine.
The path to peace goes through a two-state solution.
We have recognized both the state of Israel and the state of Palestine.
This is where many people expect this state to eventually exist. More than 5.5 million Palestinians live in these territories, many of them refugees expelled from their homes by Israel. Remember that because it's an important part of the story and we'll get to it later. But for now, I want you to pay attention to these.
You know, one thing that stands out to me every time I travel between Palestinian towns in the West Bank is how many Israeli settlements there are. They're everywhere.
You can see these white stone-walled buildings and red-tiled roofs all over the occupied West Bank. And under international law, they are all illegal because this is not Israeli land. But the people who live in these areas are Israeli settlers. In fact, about 1 in every 10 Israeli Jews lives in one of these settlements. They include high-ranking government officials, military commanders, and Israeli Supreme Court justices. The Israeli government subsidizes their lifestyle with cheaper housing and tax breaks. These settlements are built on land confiscated by force from Palestinians. Stolen is another word for it. And the settlements are built between Palestinian towns and villages, cutting people off from each other and from their own natural resources. The infrastructure of these Israeli settlements, security zones, settler roads, and military bases have made it impossible to create a contiguous Palestinian state here.
If you're asking me, is a Palestinian state viable with all these settlements spread out throughout the West Bank? No, it's impossible. It's impossible to have a state. That's the reference to the Swiss cheese with holes.
If the West Bank was going to become part of a Palestinian state, then these holes would have to be filled in by absorbing the settlements into this future Palestine. Either the Israeli settlers would come under Palestinian rule, or they'd have to be removed. It's hard to imagine Israel forcing hundreds of thousands of its citizens out of the settlements it spent decades building for them. In fact, Israel has said that it wants to annex those settlements and keep them for itself. The settlements are the most obvious reasons why Palestinian statehood in the West Bank remains highly unlikely. It's a reason you can see and feel. It's a reason that's literally made of concrete. But there are also a lot of political reasons. Let's go back a few decades. The closest we've ever been to a two-state solution was the 1993 Oslo Accords, a deal signed by the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. The PLO had given up its claims to historic Palestine and hoped the Oslo Accords would lead to a Palestinian state in just the West Bank and Gaza. As part of the Accords, the PLO recognized Israel. Israel did not recognize a Palestinian state in return. The Israeli Prime Minister at the time was the Labour Party's Yitzhak Rabin.
The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been shot. A Jewish gunman attacked him tonight at a peace rally in Tel Aviv.
Rabin's assassin accused him of giving up too much to the Palestinians. But Rabin had never intended to accept full Palestinian independence. He said the most Palestinians would ever get was an entity less than a state. And this has always been the most that any Israeli government has been willing to consider. For example, Rabin was seen as a liberal. But Israel's longest-serving prime minister, the conservative right-wing Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that the most he'd allow Palestinians to have is a state minus. And as we were recording this, the Israeli parliament voted to reject the creation of a Palestinian state. So the rejection of a fully independent Palestinian state is mainstream in Israeli politics. In contrast, even Hamas, the other major Palestinian movement, has said that if a real Palestinian state were to be founded in the West Bank and Gaza, it would accept that. Obviously, the Oslo Accords did not lead to an independent Palestinian state, and there haven't been serious negotiations for a resolution since early 2001. But one thing every Israeli government has done, even when there were negotiations, was to build more settlements. Here's Israeli historian Avi Schleim describing that strategy.
He's like a man who pretends to negotiate over the division of a pizza and he keeps eating it.
I promise that was the last food analogy in this video, but this whole idea of cutting up the land and dividing it is not new. It's actually a pretty old one. So old that there's an argument that partition, trying to create two states on this land, is the cause of this conflict. Let me explain. In 1917, the British Empire occupied Palestine and promised to establish a Jewish homeland there. Now, that was a problem because Palestine was not empty, and only 6% of its population was Jewish. So, over the next 30 years, Britain tried to change those demographics. It encouraged the immigration of European Jews to Palestine and helped them build the infrastructure of a state.
Today, the refugee from Germany finds 350,000 Jews in Palestine. Finds himself one of 50,000 a year pouring in from all over the world. No more than 50,000 because that is the quota Britain has set.
At the same time, it brutally repressed Palestinian resistance to British occupation and put down any attempt by Palestinians to build a state of their own. And Britain created multiple commissions and reports, like this one, to answer the question of how to turn Palestine into a Jewish state. The answer often came back as partition, dividing the land into two countries, one Arab and one Jewish. The two-state solution. But because Palestinians were the majority, this meant that hundreds of thousands of them would have to be expelled to create a state with a sustainable Jewish majority. By the end of World War II, an exhausted Britain was retreating from its global empire and gave up sorting out the problem it had created in Palestine.
The Union Jack was hauled down and the doors closed for good on the British mandate.
It punted the question to the newly created United Nations, which in 1947 voted to partition Palestine and to give 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews were still a minority. The UN plan didn't explain how this state would be Jewish when, even in that territory, Jews weren't a clear majority. So the leaders of what would become Israel began changing those demographics by force. They began expelling the Palestinian population, eventually emptying more than 450 cities, towns, and villages. Israel declared itself a state in May 1948 and defeated a feeble, unorganized military intervention by several poorly equipped Arab armies. By the time the fighting stopped, Israel controlled not just 55%, but 78% of the land. Most importantly, it had driven out 750,000 Palestinians, 3/4 of the population, and has never allowed them to return. Palestinians call this the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. And in 1967, Israel went on to occupy the rest of what had been Palestine. Since then, attempts at creating a two-state solution have focused on reversing what happened in 1967. They ignore what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, when they were displaced and made stateless. Today, there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees, those who were kicked out by Israel and their descendants. If partition was to finally succeed and we end up with two states, where would they go? You might assume they'd all go to the new state of Palestine. But under international law, refugees have the right to return to where their homes were, which would be inside Israel today. So here we are again, trying to square this circle. To become a Jewish state, Israel forced out most of the non-Jews. Letting them back in, which Israel is obligated to do under UN Resolution 194 adopted in 1948, would make Jews a minority again. You know, the refugee issue isn't a minor problem. For Palestinians, the right to return is at the center of their struggle and identity. But even if we were to ignore that and just focus on creating a Palestinian state on the ground, we have to deal with the fact that neither Israel nor its main backer, the United States, really accept the idea of Palestinians having full sovereignty. They insist that a Palestinian state can't have its own military, for example. It's hard to imagine Palestinians accepting that, especially considering what happened during the Nakba or Israel's current destruction of Gaza. Still, let's assume that all those issues were resolved or put to the side. In that scenario, Palestinians would accept a state on 22% of their homeland. That's the West Bank and Gaza. They'd agree to Israel annexing the settlements it has built on that land. Millions of Palestinian refugees would give up their right to return to their homes. Palestine would be made up of disconnected territories, and it would have less sovereignty than any other country on earth. What would a two-state solution mean for Israel? Because Israel's own laws define the country as a place where the right to self-determination is reserved for Jewish Israelis only. As Benjamin Netanyahu once said, Israel is the national state not of all its citizens, but only of the Jewish people. That's a problem when about 20% of your population isn't Jewish. These are Israel's Palestinian citizens, the ones who managed to stay behind during the Nakba. If a separate Palestinian state is established and Israel remains a Jewish state, what would happen to them? Some Israeli officials have been explicit about wanting to expel them to any future Palestinian state, although most Israeli politicians refuse the idea of that state ever existing. So we keep coming back to the same point. Every attempt to partition the land and separate Israeli Jews and Palestinians ends in either population expulsion or a system where people have different rights based on the community they were born into. So to recap, Israel's illegal settlements and land grabs have pretty much made the founding of a Palestinian state impossible. But even if that wasn't the case, just creating a Palestinian state doesn't fix the core issue of this conflict, the forced expulsion of most of the Palestinian population. It also doesn't address the discrimination facing Israel's non-Jewish citizens. The two-state solution doesn't solve any of these problems. What the two-state solution does is try to preserve a Jewish majority state that was only created by forcing the Palestinians out. And to be honest, all of this is based on hopes from decades ago. It doesn't reflect the reality of today, where Israel has destroyed Gaza and effectively annexed the West Bank already. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, like many other human rights groups, describes that reality as apartheid, a system of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. Maybe the solution isn't to find new ways to separate the people on this land by ethnic division, but to strive for equality among all. So all those officials from around the world that talk about a two-state solution, perhaps they should also drive around the occupied West Bank, understand the reality, and then figure out what they'll do to change it. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I know this isn't the simplest topic, so in the description, you'll find a link to all of the sources we used so you can do some further reading yourself. And please also watch this video about how Israel was created. I think it helps put this story into context.